A state has an army, a police force, and taxes. But in the 21st century, there is another form of power, the power over the screen. Today, it is often not the state, but a handful of technology companies that decide which application you see when you open your eyes in the morning, which search result you click on, which video appears in your feed, and which advertisement convinces you. The European Union does not define these companies as gatekeepers of the digital world for nothing. They even explicitly state in official language that these entities have become private rulemakers in the market. On September 6, 2023, Alphabet, Amazon, Apple, ByteDance, Meta, and Microsoft were designated as such, and on March 9, 2026, the EU announced that it continues to review the new compliance reports of these companies. Now, let us ask the question clearly. Are these companies truly more powerful than the state? They may not have tanks. However, the attention, data, shopping, communication, and increasingly the infrastructure of billions of people pass through their systems. Meta reported reaching an average of 3.35 billion people daily in December 2024. The United Nations, on the other hand, estimated the world population to be approximately 8.2 billion in mid-2024. This means that roughly 4 out of every 10 people in the world interact with at least one Meta product every day. In the past, empires controlled territory. Today's tech giants control the flow of information, the flow of attention, the flow of advertising, the flow of payments, app distribution, and cloud infrastructure. Therefore, reading them merely as large companies remains insufficient. Because the issue is no longer just that they make a lot of money, they also write the rules of the game. The European Commission's DMA approach says exactly this. These platforms are critical gateways between businesses and users, and this position allows them to act like private rulemakers in the market. The figures also support this. Alphabet's total revenue in 2024 exceeded $350 billion. $264.6 billion of this came directly from Google advertising, and the company reported to the SEC that more than 75% of its 2024 revenue originated from online advertising. Meta's 2024 revenue reached $164.5 billion. The company states in its own annual report that almost all of its revenue comes from advertising on Facebook and Instagram. Amazon's total revenue in 2024 was $638 billion. The revenue of AWS alone rose to $108 billion. In other words, these structures are no longer companies operating in a single sector. They are giant systems where advertising, cloud, commerce, and distribution are gathered in the same hands. On the Apple side, power operates differently. Apple tells developers clearly, the standard commission for digital goods and services sold through the App Store is 30%. This rate drops to 15% in some small business programs. This means that for thousands of companies wanting to enter the iPhone world, Apple is not just a device manufacturer, but also a private economic border gate. Decisions such as which payment system will be used for sales or whether the user can be directed outside the application can suddenly affect entire industries. The real breaking point is this. States are slow to pass laws, while platforms are very fast to change rules. While a parliament debates for months, a platform can change the revenue model of millions of businesses in a single update. Meta also explicitly writes to its investors that changes in third-party mobile operating systems and browsers adversely affect its own ad targeting and measurement tools. In other words, a step taken by Apple can affect Meta's business model. A step taken by Google can affect the traffic of media companies, and a step taken by Amazon can affect the margins of sellers. This is now something larger than classic market competition. The first major example is Google. According to the U.S. Department of Justice's statement dated September 2, 2025, the court imposed significant sanctions against Google's illegal monopolization of the search market. The department stated that Google controlled approximately 90% of search queries in the U.S. for many years, maintaining this through exclusionary agreements that ensured it was the default search engine on billions of devices and computers. The same statement recalls that in August 2024, the court explicitly concluded that Google was a monopoly. This is critical because what is being discussed here is not just making a good product, but freezing competition by closing the distribution gate. The second example is Amazon. The lawsuit filed by the FTC in September 2023 accuses Amazon of unlawfully maintaining monopoly power in online superstore and marketplace services. There is a very striking detail in the complaint. The FTC alleges that in order to do business on Amazon, some sellers are forced to leave nearly 50% of their revenue to Amazon due to combined fees. It is also claimed that Amazon lowers organic quality in search results to prioritize advertising and favors its own products. These allegations have not been finalized by the court, but they show that if a platform becomes both the marketplace, the referee, the tax collector, and the competitor, the economy transforms into a nearly private administrative order. The third example is Apple. On April 23, 2025, the European Commission ruled that Apple violated its anti-steering obligations under the DMA and fined the company €500 million. On the same day, Meta was fined €200 million for violating the obligation to offer users a service option that uses less personal data. These decisions are very important because Europe is explicitly saying here for the first time, these platforms do not only offer products, they also determine how trade is conducted. In other words, the discussion is no longer just about technology, but about sovereignty. The fourth example is Meta. In January 2026, the FTC appealed the first instance decision of November 2025, which had been in favor of Meta, and continued to argue that the company had maintained its monopoly position in personal social networking services for years by acquiring Instagram and WhatsApp. The issue here is not just past acquisitions. The issue is this: if a company buys products that could be competitors before they even grow, innovation is chosen not by the market but by giant balance sheets. Meta's size is therefore read not only as an economic problem but also as a political one. Because when the infrastructure of social interaction is concentrated in a few hands, the public sphere shrinks. And the most critical new dimension of the matter: AI and infrastructure. Alphabet made $52.5 billion in capital expenditures in 2024. Amazon's cash capital expenditure in 2024 was $77.7 billion. Meta's 2024 capital expenditures reached $39.23 billion. We're talking about an infrastructure investment of over $169 billion in a single year. This is not just investment in technology. It is a kind of geo-economic mobilization in data centers, chips, networks, energy, and computing power. Formerly, states produced power by building railways and ports. Today, companies produce power through data centers and model training infrastructure. That is why the issue is not just a regulatory war between America and Europe. The real issue is the question of who will own the infrastructure in the digital age. Project Waterworth, announced by Meta in February 2025, was introduced as a submarine cable project that will span 5 continents and be more than 50,000 kilometers long when completed. In the same announcement, Meta states that submarine cables are the backbone of global digital infrastructure, carrying more than 95% of intercontinental traffic. This means that the entity we call a social media company no longer just develops applications, it also invests in the data highways of the planet. The global consequence of this is immense. If a few American companies simultaneously control the advertising market, app distribution, search, cloud, and physical connection infrastructure, then what countries call digital sovereignty may remain only on paper. Europe's gatekeeper approach, the Google-Amazon Meta lawsuits in the US, and the compliance processes extending into 2026 are actually different versions of the same fear. States are trying to reclaim not just economic power, but the authority to set rules. This is my inference, but its basis is clear. The EU officially views these companies as gatekeepers and actors carrying the risk of becoming private rulemakers, while US institutions file monopoly lawsuits against them. Another global effect is this. These companies now compete with countries not only in the market, but also in strategic priorities. In which country will a data center be established? Which language model will be launched in which market first? Which payment system will be supported? Which application will remain in the store? And which will become invisible? These seem like technical decisions, but their consequences extend from employment to media, from election campaigns to SME revenues. Therefore, reading big tech companies only as a Silicon Valley story would now be a serious mistake. These are increasingly becoming political economic actors of the global order. This is a result that emerges from reading company revenues, infrastructure investments, app store rules, DMA decisions, and antitrust lawsuits together. So let us return to the initial question. Are big tech companies' new empires stronger than the state? My answer is this. In some areas, yes, but not in the classical sense. They have no armies, no borders, and no prison systems. But they are faster than most states in writing the invisible constitution of daily life. They have the power to determine which information we reach first, which business will be visible, which developer will make payments, and which company will access cloud infrastructure. And the wave of lawsuits and regulations between 2024 and 2026 shows us this. States are aware of this as well and are now trying to limit this power. Perhaps the right question is not, have these companies surpassed the state? The right question is, will the 21st century state be able to truly audit these digital empires while protecting its citizens? Because if it cannot, in the world of the future, governments will win elections, but platforms will write the rules. And now I leave the question to you. Do you think companies like Google, Apple, Amazon, and Meta should be regulated like public utilities? Should they be broken up? Or is their immense size necessary for innovation? Write in the comments. Because this discussion is not a technology discussion. It is a discussion directly about power, democracy, and the economy of the future.